The second week in November might not seem like the appropriate time to be making modifications to your pasture for next year. However, a group of people learned last night that this can be the ideal time to go after troubled weed spots, take soil samples, and also take inventory of your vegetation. All this education came during a pasture walk hosted by the Des Moines Area Community College and the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. The event was held at the DMACC Teaching Farm north of Adel. Chris Clark is a beef specialist with ISU Extension. He talked about the impact of pastures and how their care affects the animals you have grazing on them. Mainly he focused on beef cattle, but as a veterinarian he had some insight into dairy cattle and others.
I think as we drive around the countryside, we see some pastures here and there that could stand to be improved a little bit. And I think the idea there is just to help producers be more profitable and more successful.
So from a cattle standpoint, what kind of things should producers be if they're out there looking at those pastures, at this time of year, November, thinking maybe there's not a lot they can do anymore? Is there still time for them to make some adjustments, and what kind of things should they be aware of when they're checking their pastures?
Yeah, you bet. So we talked tonight a little bit about, that the fall can be a good time to do soil testing. And so there's still maybe some opportunity to do that before the ground freezes up. Certainly there can still be maybe some opportunities for weed control, although we are maybe pushing the limit on that depending on how the weeds are handling the cooler nights here. But fall can be a good time for controlling some weeds and applying some herbicides. I think one of the things that we talk about sometimes is just the importance of rest and recovery time for pasture. And so obviously coming into this season, we've had some pretty warm weather this fall and some opportunity probably to graze for kind of an extended period during the fall. But perhaps if some pastures are getting mowed down and getting grazed down close, it might be an opportunity just to pull cattle off and give them a little time to recover and store some energy for winter.
And so what kind of options are out there for, you talked about herbicide treatments. We see some spots that are just terrible. So, for example, tonight we saw a patch of Canada thistle that was basically said, Meghan kind of made the comment, let's go nuclear on this thing.
Sure.
What kind of things should farmers be aware of with animal health, especially this time of year? Would it be better just to pull them off, maybe treat it, and then leave them off for the rest of this part of the year? Could they come back on? What kind of options are there for them?
So I would leave the specifics to the herbicide treatments to Meghan for sure. She's a weed scientist and agronomist and much, much better at that than I am. I think when it comes to that, you really just need to follow the label directions. And, my background's in veterinary medicine, and so I kind of lean on that label for antibiotics and other treatments like that. The same kind of thing applies to the labels for herbicides. I think the label is really the law, and we have to follow those directions. Some of them will have 0-day grazing withdrawals or 0-day grazing restrictions. And so in those cases, you don't necessarily have to pull the cattle off. Although, maybe it's wise to do that for a period of time and just kind of let the herbicide do its thing and let the grasses kind of rest and rejuvenate a little bit. I think maybe that's an idea in some cases. But yeah, that's probably the best I got there.
You also talked about with the grazing, having a balance of legumes and grasses and things like that. What kind of things should farmers be looking at for that?
Yeah, so that can be a challenge. In Iowa, we rely pretty heavily on cool season grasses. So brome, orchard grass, tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass. And so we tend to have kind of a slump in the summertime where those grasses just don't grow very well. And so if we can incorporate legume, that can be very helpful. The other thing that we sometimes try to do is get some warm season pastures established. And so you get some things like Indian grass and blue stem and stuff like that. There's potential there, but those are a little bit hard to manage and a little bit slow to establish. So a lot of times it comes down to trying to just manage those cool seasons as best we can and try to incorporate some red clover, white clover, maybe even alfalfa, to try to kind of extend that grazing through the summer slump and kind of improve some quality there.
What kind of, so if farmers are looking at their pasture and going, what should I be thinking about? Where can they go find some information, ask some questions? Where's a good resource for them to start?
Yeah, you bet. So, I think we like to say at Iowa State University Extension kind of provides a 99 county campus. So your local extension office is maybe a good starting point to get in touch with folks from ISU. And we have regional specialists all throughout the state in various different fields. So we have beef specialists that can help. We have agronomists or crop specialists that can help. even when we get to other areas. Patrick Hadding was here tonight. He's our area farm management specialist. But certainly, and like Meghan said earlier tonight, a lot of times the way we look at it is if we don't have an answer, we probably have an idea of where to send you, or we have maybe a contact or a colleague or somebody that can help. And so we've got a pretty wide, a wide net in terms of areas of expertise between the whole team. But yeah, feel free to contact local extension offices. The Iowa Beef Center has a really good website with lots of different resources there, and all of our contact information is there. But yeah, I'm more than willing to talk to folks. I do a lot of consulting one-on-one just by phone and email and stuff too, so people can sure reach out to me if they'd like.
Meghan Anderson is a Central Iowa field agronomist for ISU Extension. She talked about weed control, soil samples, and balancing the types of plants you have for vegetative health. She also gave us insight into the genetic makeups of many weeds, one of which she really highlighted was the Canada Thistle, and how what you see above ground is only a small percentage of what goes on below the surface. She talked about how sometimes herbicides may be the only option, but there are many options into treating some of these weed infestations.
Changes or making improvements in pastures, sort of from the process of knowing where you're starting at to making changes and hopefully improving the pasture as the final goal, depending on what your goals are.
Now, of course, we talked with Chris here just a minute ago talking about the livestock side of it, but you handle more of the plants, the weeds. That's where your specialty is. So tell us a little bit about some of the things that producers should be looking at if they're going into their pasture this time of year and saying, hey, I might need to do some stuff around here.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good time of year to come out and do some evaluation, especially since we finally got some rainfall this fall and things have recovered a little bit from our droughty conditions that we've had this year. But really, it's a good time of year to start with the kind of basic evaluation, trying to be as objective as possible, looking at things like, how many beneficial species or desirable species do I have out here? What do I have for weeds? Do I have open ground? Things like that. And starting that process of, okay, are there problems that need to be remedied, and how might I remedy them? So this is a great time of year to do things like soil sampling if we've maybe never done it or haven't done it in the last maybe 6 to 10 years. Do things like even weed control. We're getting a little late on that now, but we've had this kind of reprieve with some warmer conditions and haven't really had too many freezes yet, so there's a lot of plants that are still in pretty good condition to take up some herbicide, and then making some plans for maybe some fertility improvements for next year, or doing things like interseeding or frost seeding, or maybe even renovation in some cases, depending on the status of the pasture. And so there's a lot of things that we can do in the fall, sort of, in order to prepare for a more successful year the next year.
So you talked about herbicide treatment. Some people might think, well, it's already furrows. How much good is it going to do? Can you kind of explain to our viewers here what good that can possibly do to help them get control again?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously you need to evaluate what kind of weed species you have, and how much of maybe your pasture area they're taking up, whether or not you might need something like a spots treatment of a herbicide or a broadcast treatment. But really, the fall is a great time to treat. We are, of course, getting a little late now, but there's some pretty good research that has shown that even after several freezes, as long as the plant tissue is still in good condition and we can get some warm air temperatures, we still can be fairly successful in our treatments, even fairly late into the fall. So I think one of the pieces of research that I read showed that even after like 11 freezes, hard freezes, treating at the end of November, they were still getting maybe 50 to 60% control. Of course, if we get just a handful of freezes, we could be more in the 80% control of the same type of species. But we still have an opportunity to maybe catch some of these and handicap them going into next year, in order to maybe nudge some weeds out and hopefully provide a better opportunity for our desirable species.
Now, you used Canada Thistle as an example about how plants and how you have to attack different plants. I'm sure every plant's got its own different root system, but when you explain what Canada Thistle does under the ground that people don't see, because it's not a very big plant, it's very short, but it's very interconnected, and you said that's only a percentage of what that plant is capable of below ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So the big ones that we would target with herbicides, of course, are going to be biennials, which survive for 2 years. and then perennials like Canada thistle. And so we've got a couple different kinds of perennials. We have ones that stay put where they are and only move via seed, things like dandelion or plantains. And then we've got stuff like Canada thistle, and Canada thistle I use as kind of that example of the plant species that you really often have to go after with a herbicide. There's not a lot of alternatives that are going to be nearly as effective because of the way it grows below ground. So for as much Canada thistle as you see above ground, that's a very small percentage of its growth, because if you start digging up below ground, you find a pretty extensive root system. So when we get a nice big established patch, you can just picture below ground what that might be, and it's probably 5 to 10 times as much of what you're seeing above ground.
So producers out there, we talked with Chris about the animal health side, but producers need to obviously look at the labels of these herbicides before they bring out their animals again, depending on what kind of livestock they've got, correct?
Absolutely. So we always want to read the label. Preferably you would read it before you ever purchase the product to make sure it's the right product for you, but then making sure that you're reading it before you use it in order to make sure that you are using it in the most effective way, right? Choosing the right rate, using any adjuvants, surfactants, things like that that you need to use to make it effective against your plant species. But then we also need to be thinking about all the warnings that are typically in the first couple pages of the label. So things like grazing restrictions, withdrawal periods, restrictions on haying are probably going to be the most important thing, and one of the longest intervals. So if you're, if you've got hay ground, you're probably going to go at a weed issue in a completely different way than you would if you have pasture that you're just never expecting that you're going to hay. But it's always important to check those labels.
Obviously, we could sit here for 2-3 hours talking about weeds, and so obviously every farmer's going to have something different they're going to be looking at. Where's a good resource for them to start and say, hey, where to get advice on where they maybe should start, and maybe at this year on what they can do, or for sure maybe in the spring what they can do for their pastures?
Yeah, absolutely. So on our extension crops page, we've got some really good resources on like pasture weed control, just kind of general resources. For things like weed ID, our extension store has a really good weed ID guide. I've got some copies of that as well if anybody would like an actual hard copy of it to get a hold of. And then your local extension field agronomist is a pretty good resource if you need help with ID and you just can't figure out the plant species otherwise.
You can find our full video coverage of last night's pasture walk near Adel by going to our Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network YouTube channel. You can also find links to it through our social media networks as well. For the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, I'm Dustin Hoffmann.